The ruins of Veltara stretched out in every direction like the broken bones of something that had once been alive. Crumbled towers leaned against each other for support. Burned-out shells of buildings stood with their walls split open, their insides exposed to the pale yellow sky. The ground was covered in ash and dust, and the wind moved through the empty streets in long, slow sighs, as if the planet itself was tired. There were no civilians left in this part of the settlement. They had been evacuated weeks ago, before the conflict between the Drakari border clans and the Valorian merchant fleets had turned this corner of the colony into rubble. Calvin Marsh walked slowly through the ash, a battered survey scanner hanging from his shoulder and a worn field pack strapped to his back. He was not a soldier. He was not a diplomat. He was a relief worker, one of a small team sent by the Galactic Relief Coalition to assess which structures were still usable and which areas were safe enough for the first wave of returning civilians. It was quiet, careful work, and Calvin was good at it. He had been doing it for 9 years on 7 different planets, and he had learned to read ruins the way some people read books. He was 34 years old, of medium build, with short brown hair that needed cutting, and a pair of dark eyes that were always watching, always measuring. He was not the kind of man who said much. His teammates back at base camp sometimes joked that Calvin communicated entirely in nods and shrugs. He did not mind the joke. He just nodded at it. He moved carefully down what had once been a wide market street, tapping notes into his scanner. A collapsed archway on the left. A cracked water line running under the pavement on the right, marked by a dark, wet stain spreading across the pale stone. A row of vendor stalls that had been burned down to their metal frames, bent and blackened and leaning at strange angles. Calvin photographed everything, noted the coordinates, and moved on. He had been out here for about 2 hours when he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind. The ruins of Veltara made all kinds of noises, groaning metal, shifting rubble, the low whistle of air moving through broken walls. Calvin had learned to sort through those sounds without thinking about them. But this sound was different. It was deep, deeper than anything the wind could make. It moved through the ground as much as through the air, and Calvin felt it in his chest before he fully heard it with his ears. He stopped walking. The sound came again, low and rolling like distant thunder, but with a rhythm to it, a pattern. And underneath the low rumble there was something else, a higher frequency, thin and trembling like a wire pulled too tight. Calvin stood very still and listened. He had spent enough years in the field to know that strange sounds in empty ruins deserved serious attention. His hand moved instinctively toward the small emergency beacon clipped to his belt, but he did not activate it yet. He just listened. The sound was coming from the far end of the market street, where a large public hall had partially collapsed. Its roof had caved in on one side, but the other end was still standing, and the tall, arched entrance was still intact. The sound was coming from inside. Calvin considered his options for a moment. A sensible man would turn around, mark the location on his scanner, and report back to base. That was the protocol. That was the safe thing to do. He walked toward the hall. He moved slowly and without making any sudden noise, stepping carefully around loose rubble and keeping close to the wall. When he reached the entrance, he stopped just outside the arch and looked in. What he saw made every thought in his mind go completely quiet. The creature inside the hall was enormous. She stood nearly 4 meters tall at the shoulder, her body long and heavy and covered in deep crimson scales that caught the pale light filtering through the broken roof. Her wings were folded tight against her back, but even folded they were vast, the tips reaching almost to both walls of the hall. Her neck was long, her head large and angular, with 2 swept-back ridges above her amber eyes, and a jaw that could close around a transport vehicle without effort. She was Drakari. Calvin knew what they looked like. Everyone in the galaxy knew what they looked like. The Drakari were one of the oldest warrior species in the known systems, feared by most, allied with almost no one, and never, under any recorded circumstances, seen behaving the way this one was behaving right now. She was crying. Not in any human way, there were no tears, but her whole enormous body was shaking in slow, rhythmic shudders, and that deep rolling sound that had carried through the ruins was coming from her throat, low and broken and unmistakably grief-stricken. Her head was bowed. Her front limbs were curled close to her chest, cradling something small. Calvin looked more carefully at what she was holding. It was a hatchling, a small Drakari cub, no larger than a large dog, its tiny crimson and gold scales dull with dust and dried blood. One of its small wings was twisted at a wrong angle. Its eyes were closed. It was breathing. Calvin could see the faint rise and fall of its small chest, but it was not moving, and it was not well. The mother held her cub the way any mother holds something precious and fragile and possibly slipping away. She held it close. She bent her great head over it, and she made that broken, rumbling sound into the quiet ruins of a burned city, with no one around to hear her, except Calvin. He stood at the entrance of the hall and did not move. His scanner was still in his hand. His emergency beacon was still on his belt. Every reasonable part of his brain was listing the reasons to step back and call this in. The Drakari were unpredictable. A grieving mother of any species was dangerous. This was far outside his job description. He took a slow breath, then he stepped inside. The moment Calvin's boot touched the floor of the hall, the mother dragon moved. It was not a slow movement. For something so large, the speed was shocking. Her head snapped up from her cub and swung toward the entrance, her amber eyes locking onto Calvin with an intensity that pressed against him like a physical force. Her lips pulled back, revealing rows of teeth that were each the length of his forearm. A sound rose from deep inside her chest. Not the grieving sound he had heard from outside, but something harder and sharper, a warning that vibrated in his teeth and made the loose rubble on the floor tremble. Calvin did not run. He stopped walking. He stood exactly where he was, just inside the entrance, and he did not move a single muscle that he did not have to move. He let his arms hang loose at his sides. He kept his hands open and visible. He did not look directly into her eyes. He had learned years ago, on a planet with large predatory mammals, that direct eye contact reads as a challenge. He looked instead at the space just below her jaw, calm and steady, the way you look at something when you want it to know you are not afraid without lying so badly that it becomes obvious. He was afraid. His heart was hitting the inside of his chest so hard he was certain she could hear it. But fear was just information. It was telling him to be careful. He was being careful. The warning sound continued for several long seconds. Her neck was extended toward him, her head low and level, her wings pressing slightly outward from her body. A threat display, huge and unmistakable. Calvin stayed still. He breathed slowly through his nose. He did not look away, but he did not challenge. He simply existed in the space, quietly, the way a thing that means no harm exists. Gradually, over the course of maybe 30 seconds that felt considerably longer, the warning sound began to lower in pitch. Her neck did not fully retract, but the rigid tension in it softened slightly. Her wings pressed back against her body. She was still watching him with those enormous amber eyes, still ready, still dangerous, but she had not moved toward him, and that was something. Calvin slowly lowered himself to one knee. It was a deliberate choice. He made the movement gradual and smooth, nothing sudden, nothing that could read as aggression. He simply went from standing to kneeling, reducing his height, making himself smaller in the space. In almost every species that Calvin had encountered across 7 planets and 9 years of fieldwork, making yourself smaller in front of a threatened creature communicated the same basic thing. I am not here to fight you. The mother dragon watched him kneel, her head tilted slightly to one side. The sound from her chest faded into silence. Calvin carefully set his scanner down on the floor beside him. Then he reached slowly for the field pack on his back and brought it around in front of him, moving one strap at a time, keeping his hands visible throughout. He set the pack on the floor and unzipped it without looking down, keeping his eyes forward, his movements deliberate. He reached inside and found the medical kit by touch, a flat rectangular case about the size of a book, hard-sided with a red marking on the lid. He lifted it out and held it up in both hands, palms facing upward. He did not speak loudly. He spoke the way you speak to someone who is frightened and exhausted and at the edge of what they can endure. Low and steady, with no sharp edges in his voice. "I am not going to hurt you," he said. "I am not going to hurt the little one. I just want to help." She did not understand the words. He knew that. The Drakari language operated on frequencies that no human vocal system could produce, and his scanner's translation function had nowhere near the processing range to handle it in real time. But he kept talking anyway, because the tone was the point, the rhythm. The fact of a voice that did not rise in pitch, did not crack with panic, did not carry aggression in any of the ways that aggression tends to announce itself across species lines. The mother dragon looked at the medical kit in his hands. Then she looked at her cub. Then she looked back at Calvin. He stayed exactly where he was and waited. Waiting was something Calvin was genuinely good at. Most people found waiting in tense situations almost impossible. The urge to do something, to speak, to move, to resolve the tension by any means necessary was overwhelming for most people. Calvin had trained himself out of that urge over many years and many difficult situations. He understood that patience was not passive. Patience was a choice you made actively, over and over, every second that passed. So he knelt on the floor of the ruined hall on a burned planet with a grieving dragon watching him, and he waited. And he breathed, and he held the medical kit in his open hands, and he did not move. 2 minutes passed, maybe 3. Then Vraka, though he did not know her name yet, would not learn it until much later, did something that he would spend a long time thinking about afterward. She shifted her weight slowly backward. She lowered herself toward the ground, bringing her cub with her until she was half crouched, half resting on the hall floor. And then, with extreme care, she extended her front limbs slightly forward, and the small, unconscious hatchling came to rest on the ground between them. Not fully released, not fully surrendered, but offered. Placed closer to him, within reach if he chose to reach. She kept one great clawed limb resting gently across the cub's back. She kept her amber eyes on Calvin without blinking. But she had moved the little one closer to him, and in any language that meant only one thing. She was asking for help. Calvin felt something move through him that was not quite emotion and not quite thought, but somewhere in between the two. He did not name it. He just nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded at everything important, and then he opened the medical kit and got to work. He moved toward the hatchling one careful shuffle at a time, staying low, keeping his movements small and smooth. When he was close enough, he stopped and looked at the cub properly for the first time. Up close, the little creature was remarkable. Small scales in crimson and pale gold, a tiny angular face that carried the same basic structure as its mother's, but softer, rounder, still young. One wing was folded correctly against its side. The other was extended at a wrong angle, the joint swollen and discolored beneath the scales. Along its left side there was a long cut, partially dried but not fully closed, dark at the edges. Calvin looked at it all carefully and quietly. Then he looked up at Vraka, who was watching him with an expression that he could not fully read, but that contained unmistakably something that looked very much like hope. "All right," he said softly. "Let us see what we can do." Calvin opened the medical kit and laid it flat on the floor beside him. Inside were the tools he had carried on every assignment for 9 years. Wound sealant, polymer strips, a small set of applicators, 2 types of pain reducer, a broad-spectrum anti-infection spray, and a handful of other items that had saved lives on more planets than he could easily count. He looked at them now and thought carefully. Drakari biology was not something he had formal training in. Nobody in the Relief Corps had formal training in it, because nobody in the Relief Corps had ever been this close to a living Drakari without a great deal of protective infrastructure between them. But Calvin had read. He read constantly, in the evenings at base camp when other team members played cards or watched entertainment feeds. He read field medicine journals, cross-species biology reports, anything the Coalition database carried. He had read a paper once, authored by a xenobiologist named Dr. Louise Farr, that covered basic Drakari physiology in the context of battlefield triage. He had read it because it was interesting, not because he ever expected to use it. He was very glad he had read it. The paper had noted that Drakari tissue, while significantly denser than human tissue, responded to broad-spectrum wound sealant without adverse reaction in most documented cases. It had also noted that their pain response system, while operating differently from human biology, shared enough common biochemical pathways that certain standard pain reducers produced a calming effect without causing harm. Calvin had both of those things in his kit. He looked at the hatchling's injured wing first. The joint was swollen and the angle was wrong, but when he looked more carefully, he could see that the bone had not broken through the skin. It was a serious injury, but it was contained. The wing needed to be moved back into correct alignment and then held in place while the joint began to stabilize. He had done similar work on a creature called a ridge flyer on a planet called Minas 4 3 years ago. The scale was different, but the principle was the same. He reached slowly toward the wing, then stopped and looked up at Vraka. She was watching his hands. Her body was still, but her breathing had changed. It was faster now, shallow, the way breathing gets when something frightening is about to happen and there is nothing to do but endure it. Her clawed limb was still resting across the cub's back, light as she could make it, which for a creature her size was still considerable. Calvin held his hands still above the wing and waited until her eyes moved from his hands to his face. When she looked at him, he held her gaze for a moment, then looked deliberately down at the wing, then back at her face. He did it again, slowly, deliberately, pointing with his eyes because he had no other language. Her breathing slowed slightly. She did not pull the cub away. Calvin took that as permission and moved carefully forward. He worked with both hands, applying gentle and consistent pressure to the swollen joint, moving the wing by small degrees back toward its correct position. The hatchling stirred once and made a thin, high sound that immediately produced a deep and frightening rumble from Vraka above him. Calvin did not freeze and did not rush. He kept the same pressure, the same speed, the same calm, and spoke quietly without stopping. "Almost there," he said. "Almost. Just a little more. You are doing well, little one." He was not sure if he was talking to the cub or to the mother, perhaps both. The wing settled back into alignment with a faint sound that Calvin felt more than heard. He held it there for a moment, checking the position, then reached for the polymer strips in his kit. They were flexible and strong, designed to conform to unusual shapes, and he used them now to build a support around the joint, layering them carefully, pressing each one down, building something that would hold the wing in place without restricting the cub's breathing or circulation. He had to improvise the shape as he went because the kit had not been designed with Drakari hatchlings in mind. But he adapted as he always adapted, quietly and without fuss. When the splint was done, he moved to the cut along the cub's side. He cleaned it first with the anti-infection spray, applying it gently with an applicator so that the cold mist would not shock the hatchling into waking too fast. Then he applied the wound sealant in slow, careful strokes along the full length of the cut, watching it bond with the tissue at the edges and begin drawing them together. It worked more slowly on Drakari scales than it would on human skin, but it worked. Calvin could see it working, and he let out a quiet breath. The last thing he did was prepare the pain reducer. It was a small injector, and he held it up where Vraka could see it before he did anything with it. He showed it to her, turned it slowly in his hand, let her look at it from every angle. Then he mimed the action of pressing it against his own arm, slowly, so she could see what it was and what it would do. He waited. She watched. After a long moment, she made a sound. Not a warning sound, not a grief sound, but something quieter and lower that Calvin had no word for. He pressed the injector gently against the side of the hatchling's neck and administered the dose. Within a minute, the tension went out of the little body. The cub's breathing deepened and steadied into something that sounded genuinely restful rather than pained. One tiny clawed foot twitched once and then went still. The small angular face relaxed, And in relaxing, it looked even younger, even smaller, even more like something that deserved to be safe in the world. Calvin sat back on his heels and looked at his work. The splint was solid. The wound was sealed. The pain reducer was doing what it was supposed to do. He had done everything he could do with what he had, and it was enough. He believed it was enough. Above him, Vraka made a sound. It was not a sound Calvin had ever heard before from any creature on any planet. It started low and rose slowly, wavering and unsteady, and it carried in it something so raw and so enormous that Calvin felt it settle into his chest like weight. It was relief. Complete and unguarded relief, pouring out of a creature that had been holding itself together by the thinnest possible thread. And Calvin understood without needing any translation at all that this was what it sounded like when a mother found out her child was going to be all right. He looked up at her. Vraka was looking down at her cub. Her amber eyes were wide and bright, and her great body was still shaking, but differently now. Not with grief, not with fear, but with something releasing. Something letting go. She lowered her enormous head toward the hatchling and rested it close to the small, sleeping body. And she made that sound again, softer this time, almost gentle, like a lullaby played on an instrument built for a different world. Calvin watched her for a moment. Then Vraka raised her head and looked directly at him. It was a different kind of look than she had given him before. Before, her eyes had carried warning and fear and desperate hope. Now they carried something else, something steady and clear and very serious. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you are trying to understand what they are, when you are revising everything you thought you knew and building something new in its place. Calvin held her gaze and said nothing. Then Vraka did something that no surveillance report, no academic paper, no field record in the entire documented history of Drakari interaction with other species had ever captured. She lowered her great head slowly and deliberately, bringing it down until her chin was nearly level with the floor, her eyes closing halfway, her whole enormous body folding into itself with unmistakable intention. She bowed. Calvin looked at her for one quiet moment. Then he leaned forward from where he sat and bowed his head in return, slow and deliberate, the same way she had done it. Neither of them spoke. The ruined hall was completely silent around them. Outside, the wind moved through the broken city, and the pale yellow sky continued on above the open roof, indifferent to everything below it. But inside the hall, something had just happened that both of them understood completely, in the only language that had never needed translation. The surveillance drone had been following Calvin for most of the morning. It was standard procedure. All relief workers operating in unsecured zones were tracked by small, automated drones that recorded video and transmitted a continuous feed back to the Coalition base camp. The drones were small enough to go unnoticed most of the time, and Calvin had long since stopped thinking about them. They were just part of the job, like the scanner and the field pack, and the worn boots he had been meaning to replace for 2 years. The drone had recorded everything. It had captured Calvin stopping in the ruined Market Street when he heard the sound. It had followed him to the entrance of the hall and recorded the moment he stepped inside. It had recorded the warning display, the kneeling, the open hands, the medical kit held up in the pale light. It had recorded every careful movement of the next hour, the splint, the wound sealant, the pain reducer, the quiet, steady voice talking to a creature that could have ended him without effort. And it had recorded the bow. Both of them. The mother dragon lowering her great head to the floor, and the human man leaning forward from where he sat and bowing his head in return. The drone feed reached base camp at the same moment it was happening. Patricia Cole was at her desk reviewing infrastructure reports when the alert came through on her secondary screen. She looked at it once, set down the report she was holding, and watched the feed without moving for the remainder of the transmission. When it ended, she sat quietly for a long moment, then pulled up the feed from the beginning and watched it again from the start. Then she forwarded it to the Coalition Regional Coordinator without any subject line or commentary, just the file. She figured it would speak for itself. She was right. The Regional Coordinator forwarded it within 20 minutes to the Coalition Communications Director, who forwarded it to 3 senior analysts, who escalated it to the Interspecies Relations Board before the end of the afternoon. By the time Calvin had walked back to base camp, field pack on his back and scanner in his hand, the footage had already been transmitted across the Coalition's internal network to offices on 4 different planets. Calvin came in through the side entrance, set his pack down by the equipment rack, and went to find something to eat. Patricia met him in the corridor outside the meal area. She was a tall woman in her mid-40s with short, gray-streaked hair and the kind of face that had learned over many years to stay neutral when neutrality was required. She was looking at him now with an expression he could not immediately identify. "How was your survey?" she said. "Productive," Calvin said. "I will write up the full report after dinner." Patricia looked at him for a moment. The drone footage came through. Calvin nodded slowly. He had known it would. "The board has already seen it," she said. "The regional office has already seen it. I have received 14 messages in the last 2 hours, which is 14 more messages than I usually receive in a week." She paused. "You stepped inside a building with an unsecured Drakari." "She needed help," Calvin said. Patricia looked at him for another moment. Then she stepped aside and let him go get his dinner. That night, while Calvin was writing his field report at the small folding table in his quarters, the footage was moving. It moved the way things move when they carry something in them that people need to see, passing from one person to the next with a speed that had nothing to do with official channels and everything to do with the simple human response to watching something that matters. Relief workers shared it with family members. Analysts sent it to old colleagues. Someone on the regional coordinator's staff posted a compressed version to a public information network, and from there it spread in the way such things spread, outward and outward, crossing boundaries that official communications rarely crossed. By morning, it had reached 6 star systems. The response from most species was one of simple and genuine amazement. The footage of a lone human kneeling in a burned building, holding a medical kit in open hands, waiting without moving while a creature 10 times his size decided whether to kill him or trust him. It was the kind of image that translated without difficulty across most known cultures. People watched it and understood it immediately, in whatever language they used for understanding things that did not need to be explained. The response from the Drakari was different. Among the Drakari, the footage did not produce amazement. It produced something closer to a crisis. The Drakari had a cultural framework that had been in place for longer than most current civilizations had existed, and within that framework, certain things were fixed and certain. One of those fixed things was the position of the Drakari in relation to other species, above, always, in strength and in pride and in the hierarchy of things that mattered. They gave no debt. They acknowledged no obligation to non-warrior kinds, and they did not bow. Vraka had bowed. Not under threat, not under compulsion, not in defeat, which would have been understandable within their framework, a warrior acknowledging a superior force. She had bowed to a small, soft creature who had knelt on a dusty floor and offered help with open hands. She had bowed in gratitude, and the entire galaxy had watched her do it. The Elder Council convened within hours of the footage reaching Drakari space. It was not a calm session. Senior council members argued in the low-frequency registers that in Drakari communication indicated extreme seriousness. Younger council voices pushed back against older ones. There were those who wanted to formally distance the council from Vraka's action, to issue a statement that reframed what had happened, to manage the damage to the Drakari image among the warrior cultures that were their primary political relationship. But there were others who watched the footage and were quiet for a long time before they spoke. One elder, whose name translated approximately as Deep Water Voice, watched the footage 3 times in the council chamber. She watched Calvin hold the medical kit in the air with open palms. She watched him kneel. She watched him work on the hatchling with careful hands, while Vraka trembled above him. She watched the bow. Then she spoke, and what she said, translated into basic coalition standard, was approximately this. This creature went into a burning place to help something that could not help itself, and it asked for nothing. We have called ourselves warriors for 10,000 years. I want to know what we call this. The chamber was quiet for a long time after that. Meanwhile, at base camp on Veltara, Calvin finished his field report. It was 3 paragraphs long. It described the structural condition of the market sector, noted the location of the cracked water line under the pavement, and included one brief section at the end about an encounter with a Drakari female and hatchling in the public hall at grid reference 74, in which emergency first aid had been administered. He recommended that a qualified xenobiologist be sent to check on the hatchling's recovery within the next 48 hours. He submitted the report, turned off his light, and went to sleep. Patricia read the report the next morning, sitting at her desk with a cup of coffee going cold beside her. She read the 3 paragraphs carefully, the way she read everything carefully. Then she sat quietly for a moment looking at the last section, at the plain and simple language of it, at the complete absence of any awareness that something enormous had just happened. She picked up her coffee, found it was cold, and set it back down. Outside the base camp, on the pale yellow planet with its broken buildings and its ash-covered streets, the wind was moving through the ruins again, the same as it always did. But something had changed in those ruins, quietly and without announcement. In a burned hall where a man had knelt on a dusty floor and a mother had learned that strangers could be trusted. The galaxy was still processing what that meant. 3 days after Calvin submitted his 3-paragraph field report, a ship entered Veltara's atmosphere. It was not a coalition vessel. It was not a merchant ship or a surveyor or any of the other craft that occasionally passed through this part of the system. It was a Drakari diplomatic vessel, long and dark and built like something that had grown rather than been constructed. Its hull the deep color of old iron, its shape angular and deliberate. It descended slowly, without haste, the way things move when they want to be seen clearly and understood correctly. Patricia was outside when it landed in the flat, open ground about 300 meters from the base camp perimeter. She stood and watched it come down, her coffee cup in her hand, her gray-streaked hair moving in the displacement wind the ship created as it settled onto the ground. Behind her, most of the base camp staff had come out to watch as well. Nobody said much. They just stood and looked at the ship sitting there in the pale morning light, dark and enormous and completely still. Calvin was the last one to come outside. He had been finishing a secondary survey report at his folding table when one of the younger team members knocked on his doorframe and told him he might want to come out. He put down his pen, came outside, looked at the ship, and said nothing. He stood beside Patricia and watched. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the main hatch of the vessel opened, and Vraka came out first. She moved carefully down the landing ramp, her crimson scales catching the morning light and throwing it back in deep reds and low golds. Behind her, walking close to her side and slightly unsteady on its feet, was Skora. The hatchling was moving on its own. Its splinted wing was held against its body, and it walked with a small, careful gait, picking its way down the ramp with the serious concentration of something that had recently been very unwell and was now determined to prove otherwise. It was the first time Calvin had seen the little one upright and conscious, and something about the sight of it walking, small and young and alive, settled into him quietly and stayed there. Behind Vraka and Skora came 3 other Drakari, larger and older, their scales darker and their movements formal and measured. One of them carried a long, flat object across both arms, holding it the way you carry something that matters. They descended the ramp and arranged themselves in a deliberate formation on the ground, and then they were still. Patricia looked at Calvin. Calvin looked at the ship. "I think they are here for you," Patricia said. Calvin walked forward. He crossed the open ground between the camp and the ship at an even pace, not too fast and not too slow, his hands loose at his sides. The morning air was cool and carried the familiar ash and dust smell of Veltara that he had grown used to over the past weeks. He stopped about 10 meters from where Vraka stood and looked at her. She looked back at him with those amber eyes, and in them he could see something that had not been there 3 days ago in the ruined hall. 3 days ago, her eyes had carried grief and fear and desperate hope. Now they carried something settled, something that had been decided. Skora made a small sound and took 3 unsteady steps away from its mother's side, moving toward Calvin with the complete absence of caution that belonged only to the very young. It covered the distance between them and stopped directly in front of him, looking up with wide eyes that were the same amber color as Vraka's but brighter, still new to the world. Then it pressed its small snout against Calvin's hand. Calvin looked down at the small creature pressing its face against his fingers, and he did not move his hand away. He let it rest there, warm and present, and he stayed very still, the way he had learned to stay still in the hall 3 days ago, because some moments asked for stillness, and this was one of them. Nobody spoke, but from somewhere behind him, Calvin heard one of his teammates make a sound that was very quickly and unsuccessfully suppressed. The oldest of the 3 formal Drakari stepped forward. He was enormous, even by Drakari standards, his scales the dark color of deep water, his movements carrying the particular weight of someone who had been important for a very long time. He spoke, and the translation unit that one of the Coalition's interspecies liaisons had brought out from camp rendered his words into standard with a slight delay. The Elder Council of the Drakari people acknowledges what was done in the hall of the 7th District of Veltara Colony. The Council formally requests that this human be named Bridge-bearer between the Drakari people and the human species. This is an honor that has not been offered to any non-warrior kind in the recorded history of our people. Calvin listened to the translation. Then he was quiet for a moment. "I am grateful," he said. "I will accept on one condition." There was a pause among the formal Drakari. The elder's eyes moved over Calvin with an expression that suggested conditions were not something he encountered often. "The agreement must include a mutual aid clause," Calvin said. "Both species commit to assisting each other's civilians in crisis situations, not soldiers, civilians, families, children, anyone who needs help and cannot help themselves." The elder looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Vraka. Vraka met his gaze steadily. She did not speak, but something passed between them that the translation unit could not capture and did not try to. The elder looked back at Calvin. He inclined his great head once, slowly, in a gesture that needed no translation at all. "The council agrees," the translation unit said. Patricia, standing at the edge of the camp perimeter, let out a breath she had been holding without realizing it. Around her, the base camp staff stood quietly in the morning light, watching something happen that none of them had words for yet, that would take time to understand fully, that would be written about and discussed and argued over in diplomatic chambers and academic papers and ordinary conversations for years to come. But right now, it was just a flat piece of ground on a burned planet, and a dark ship sitting in the morning light, and a small hatchling with a splinted wing standing next to a man who had walked into a ruined hall because someone needed help. Skora pressed its snout against Calvin's hand one more time. Somewhere across 6 star systems, on screens and feeds and in shared files passed from person to person, 11 billion beings were watching the footage from the surveillance drone. They were watching a man kneel on a dusty floor with a medical kit in his open hands. They were watching a mother dragon lower her great head to the ground. They were watching the bow, and the bow returned, in a burned hall where nobody was watching except a small automated drone that had simply been doing its job. People watched it in offices and in homes, and in the break rooms of research stations, and the common areas of colony ships moving slowly between stars. They watched it in places where 3 different species shared the same habitat, and in places where humans lived entirely alone. They watched it in the middle of arguments, and in the quiet of early mornings and late at night when the day was done and they were looking for something to hold on to. They watched it because it was true. Not true the way facts are true, though it was that as well. True the way certain things are true that go past fact into something deeper, something that does not need to be explained because it is already known by everything that has ever been alive and afraid and found in a moment of complete vulnerability that the stranger in front of it meant no harm. Calvin did not watch the footage. He did not think of himself as someone who had done something remarkable. He had seen a mother holding her injured child in a burned building, and he had gone inside, and he had done what he could with what he had. That was all. That was everything. On the ground in front of him, Skora yawned enormously, showing a set of very small and very sharp teeth, then turned around and walked back to its mother on careful feet. Vraka lowered her head and touched her nose gently to the top of the hatchling's head. Then she looked once more at Calvin, and the look she gave him was simple and clear and complete. Calvin nodded once, the way he nodded at everything important. Then he turned and walked back to camp to finish his report.